Today we're going to talk about some of the questions that we get from people around the work that we do in decision clarity, power, and decision making. And one of the questions that we get that I want you to answer is this question of, my CEO is such a micromanager. How can I advocate for more power in decision making?
Well, Deidre, as you know, this is a pretty common problem, and lots of times people have bosses or CEOs that fit into that category, and we can break it down in a couple of different ways. Sometimes people are micromanagers because that's what they're used to. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're micromanagers because they don't trust. Sometimes they're micromanagers because they just don't have the connection to the person that they really need to in order to let go of their decision making. And this is really important to break down. I mean, lots of times people are in these situations and they're not even conscious of the fact that they're micromanaging.
Yeah.
So it's important to, when you have a boss that's micromanaging, to go to that person and say, you know, I've been noticing that you have been watching me pretty carefully as I make these decisions. Is there something that I've done which, you know, has convinced you that you should do that? Is there something that I can do that will enable you to trust me more so that I am not looking over my shoulder all the time and that you're not wasting time looking over my shoulder? Is there something that I can do to demonstrate that I have the capacity to make these decisions? These are the sort of questions that people just are afraid to ask. Sure. They don't even know that they should ask because they believe that the micromanager is doing this for a reason. And that's true, but it may not be for the reason that you think. It may be because of fear rather than because of power. It may be because of uncertainty rather than a desire to be a jerk. So I think it's really important when you sense you're being micromanaged to ask that person, is that your intention? Mm-hmm. Is that something that you mean to do? And if not, perhaps you can give me a little bit more space so that I have the time and space to make an intelligent decision.
Mm-hmm. You know, well, it has me thinking. I'm thinking about the person who maybe is a bit shy, a bit introverted, maybe has a manager who's micromanaging who is also mean, can yell in the office.
There are
mean
in those
people. Situations. So I'm wondering, what do you think about for those folks? I mean, another way I would recommend, especially with a power dynamic, right? If the power is really one-sided in terms of your manager really having a lot of power over you, and I think that I would recommend folks sit down and actually come up with very specific examples that they feel they're being micromanaged. And make sure that they have that either clear in their mind or clear on a piece of paper to be able to have this conversation. Because I think walking in there without that, for someone who's shy or there's a power dynamic that's off, you can get thrown off by the defensiveness that could come up with a micromanager, with a person who manages in that way, or just get flustered in and of yourself. So it's kind of like when we talk to people in our trainings about advocating, like you just don't get to advocate for any decision willy-nilly. You have to do the research. You have to be very clear about what it is you're advocating for. What are the implications of this decision? You know, have thought about who are the people you should involve. Like, be really thoughtful about what you're requesting. And I think the same could be said about confronting, because you're essentially confronting your manager. Just to walk into that situation empowered with as much information as possible about, you know, your experiences of being micromanaged, right? You know?
Right, absolutely. And further riff on what you just said is that you can, invoking the age-old and really wonderful Seinfeld episode where George decides he's going to do the opposite of what he does normally, you can just simply go into your manager and do something really surprising and say, listen, Bob, Barbara, whatever, I want to advocate to make a particular decision. I want to do the research, I want to consult with people, and then I want to make this decision. How do you feel about that? Because I really think I have got some special abilities and thoughts about what needs to happen, and I would like to take this off your plate. Right. And not have you worry about it.
Abilities, right? I don't even know they have to be special. I think for a micromanager, they don't even see where there's just people doing their job, right? It's not even necessarily a special ability.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Which makes me think of, like, I think that this is a good question from the person who's being micromanaged. But what about the person who's micromanaging? And I think, in my experience, there's a lot of people, you gave examples of why folks might be micromanaging, and the one that I didn't hear is that I think we put a lot of people in positions of management who have never been taught how to manage, right?
Yeah,
Who
absolutely.
like they just have not, and it is a skill.
Mhm.
It is a skill that you should practice and seek out different ways in which you engage human beings in the workplace, which is managing people. So I would say for the folks who are listening to this who are managers and you're finding yourself caught in being a micromanager, but you just don't know what else to do, I would definitely recommend looking into our iPact for Impact, because that is a way that you can manage folks without having to micromanage, right? Be really clear about what are the decisions before your team, go through an inventory process with them, go through a prioritization process with them, because you'll have more information, you'll know what your team is prioritizing, you'll maybe feel less of a need to hover. Let your team advocate for what you just said, you'll know what your team has, either just interest or the special talent that you mentioned. And then communicate that out, right? So it's like everyone is clear. So as a manager, I think we're less likely to hover and be ever present with the folks who report to us when there's more communication and more clarity about what they're doing, right? I think a lot of folks micromanage because there's a lack of clarity and a sense of chaos, and they feel like if I don't do all of it myself, it's just not going to get done because they don't know how it's getting done, right?
Right. I think that's the key point. They don't know how it's getting done. They have got so much going on, they don't have the time to break down how it's going to get done. And there's another point that I think is really worth bringing up, which is trust. Mm-hmm. People often are unable or unwilling to look at the degree to which they trust other human beings in their lives and in their jobs. And if you come at a job from the point of view of, or if you come at life from the point of view that I'm just not very trusting, unless you really get into and do the work to get into why you're not very trusting and understand how that lack of trust impacts your own personal life and your organization, you're not going to trust. And being able to create an environment where people feel trusted is creating an environment where you'll be able to get the most out of your team. Mm-hmm. So I would say, yes, all the stuff we talked about, being clear about your micromanaging tendencies, understanding how and when you trust, understanding how and when you don't trust, are all keys to understanding the micromanager. For the person who is being micromanaged, it's important to have some sort of empathetic perspective on that person and have the personal bravery to step forward and say, I can do this, you don't need to worry about it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that goes both ways, right? It's
right.
Like the manager has to step up and trust the team just as much as the team needs to step up and trust the manager.
Right.
I feel like a person, like I've been in a lot of situations in a lot of different trainings or conferences or conversations where a lot of the onus is put on those who are being managed poorly, which I find really interesting, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, it's the power dynamic where it's like, well, if you just knew how to be managed better, which is ridiculous, right? At least in my mind, it's like, you're managing me, which means presumably you're making more money than I am. You have a higher title. So I think that for me, in my experience, the onus really needs to be put on the manager a bit more of like, at least create a space, because we go back to that power dynamic. Like, you have to create space in which a person can come up and say, hey, I want to take on this task, or confront the lack of trust. And I mean, I get it's kind of hard, right? Because we're speaking to two audiences. I get that for the person who's being managed poorly, you may not have the opportunity to have a manager who's going to self-reflect and really change their management skills. So it makes sense that you have to take it on. And it's almost like taking that leap of faith that if I put this out there, maybe something good would come of it. And at the same time, I think in those situations where managers are watching this, like, we need to be better managers and we need to take more responsibility of our impact as managers and our impact as poor managers. Right. And not just put it on the team all the time, because that's what I just hear over and over again, and I don't think that's fair.
Right, and I don't think it's fair either, and I think there's a sort of presumption that managers know best when they really don't, and I think the point that you made earlier about there's not as much management training as there needs to be, and There's not as much attention put to it in the day in and day out life that we lead. One thing I do want to say from an encouraging point of view for those who might want to go and talk to their managers, a couple of things. Number one, don't think of it as a confrontation, think about it as a conversation. There is an implicit belief that I am going to have to wrest power from this person. And actually, I think more often than not, when managers are talking with individuals who want to take on more responsibility, they're pleasantly surprised because they don't know that people really want to step up, and they're so inundated with the day in and day out that they're not thinking along those lines. So most of the people, at least in my experience, that go out and advocate for decision making actually get it. It's not a perfect thing. It's not true all the time. There will be some people that don't understand what you're doing and are threatened, but more often than not, the day in and day out grind of being a leader in an organization is very suffocating for managers. Even though they get the perks and they get the higher salary, it can be troubling for them, and they are just as lost as everybody else is. And if you just go up and have a conversation rather than a confrontation and advocate for what you want, I bet you more often than not you'll get what you want.
I wouldn't take that bet, but you have much more experience in this world than I do, so take that. But,
well, let's look at it
but
this way.
I want to say, I love that. I love that idea. I like the think of it as a conversation instead of a confrontation. And like if I were in the position of folks who need to go talk to their manager, I would write that at the top of my piece of paper, at the top of my notes. Just to remind me, because I know for me, the way my personality is, like my heart's going to be pounding, I'm going to be super nervous, my hands are going to be sweaty, because it is confrontation, right? It is, you're telling your manager that I want to take on more, and and I don't need you hovering on me. Maybe that's not the language you would use, but it also, as soon as you said, think of it as a conversation, not a confrontation, that kind of set me at ease. So I appreciate that. And I absolutely, I think that's a great skill. And you said there were a couple things. What were the other?
Right. I think at the end of the day, managers are looking for ways to move their organizations forward and to connect with their team. And they often do not know how to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
And so imagine the shock and pleasant surprise that they'll have if somebody actually comes to them, somebody they know and somebody they trust, hopefully, and says, I think I can do more for us. I can do more for our organization. And here's what I want to do. Those conversations hardly ever happen. And if they did happen, then managers would be surprised. It's sort of like going on offense. Rather than waiting for your manager to come to you with your assignments, go to that person if there's something that you really want to do and say, I want to do this. I can do it.
Yeah.
Let me do it. It'll be good. I mean, imagine the situation where people are signing up for more responsibility because they feel very passionate about what they're doing. The major complaint from organizations and leaders is, I can't get my team motivated. Well, maybe you can't get them motivated because you're not creating an environment where they feel free to advocate.
Right.
And that's really the key. So I do think conversation, not confrontation. And I bet, here, I'll have a little side bet with you, I bet 7 times out of 10, because in truth, when people advocate in our work, usually 8 or 9 times out of 10, they get what they want anyway.
Right, that's in the context of our
I
work,
understand.
right?
So I think, I'm willing to make a prediction that in the world in which we're not really active, that people 6 times out of 10 will get what they want. Even if it's 5 if it's 5 times out of 10, that's 5 people doing more empowered work in their world than otherwise would have happened.
But that's why we're a good pair, because you're much more
optimistic.
Yes.
And you're more?
I'm less optimistic. I think people can learn. I think people can change, but they need to be taught to change. So I just worry, I think, in my experience, and I mean, think about it this way, that's a difference in our age, a difference in our race and our gender. Like, my experience has been the gay black woman, pushing usually white male managers to relinquish some power, right? To let me do my job.
No, it's very true.
So I think that in my experience, I think that if my manager is secure in whatever it is he needs to be secure in, that's in his job or his manhood, I don't know.
Right.
The experience that I've had where I've had to muster up the courage to say, I don't need to be managed that way, which is, if you buy Steve's book, the forward is all about one of my first experiences really pushing and saying, this is not how I should be managed. And you were amazing in that interaction. But that was not always the norm, right? The norm has been that as humans, we get defensive, right? And so the manager has been quite defensive about it. And I've gotten pushback. So that's all I'm saying. And I think it's a good way to segue into the other topics. I think one of the things that people have asked us about is like this idea of race, gender, and class and how it impacts decision making. And I think I can understand, if I put myself in your shoes, I can understand how your experiences perhaps have gone better as a white man in having these conversations as opposed to confrontation. But there's something definitely for me as a Black woman, I could ask the same question that a white man asks around power and decision making, and I'm seen as bringing confrontation or angry, as opposed to a white man is just assertive and he's just clarifying. And so that's just what I was saying. Like I think there's a lot there. There's a lot to move around, and there's a lot of different experiences. So I like that, you're 6 out of 10, I'm 4 out of 10. And like, I will say this, if people actually actively learn the work that we put out in the world, this decision clarity thing that we've created, using this idea of IPAC for impact, like the process of helping both managers and the person being managed be much clear about what they want to do and what they're going to do, I would move that up to 8 out of 10. Because in our experiences in the work, yes, like no one has ever advocated for something, well, not no one, very limited times have someone advocated for something that was so out of the realm of their job, or, out of the realm of what was realistic for them to take on. But I think that's in the context of work that we do. Like our work really helps people not only look at what are the decisions before me, but look at like, what am I bringing to the table, right? So what are the privileges around race or class or my biases, like what am I bringing to the table when I start talking about decision making, or when there's confrontation in the workplace around decision making and power dynamics that helps people show up differently than if someone is just watching this and is just taking notes on how to confront a manager who's never actually had a conversation about power and decision making in the work. You know what I mean? Like,
for sure. Right, and I think race and gender and class and all of the other lenses that exist in the world are real, are important, do need to be taken into consideration. I think that one of the things I see that is so true and yet so unfortunate in our society is that these lenses create, very understandably, very reasonably, they create fear. They create fear. They create fear between people, which is just the way we are right now. And fear on the part of the person who has power that they're going to make a mistake. Though there are some people in the world who don't care if they're making mistakes and believe that political correctness is something that they want to avoid at all costs. As a side effect, or as a side note, I would say I hate the term political correctness, because it's an idiotic expression, because really at the end of the day what we're really talking about is being able to talk empathetically to other people in a way that they understand. And if you have to talk empathetically to other people so that you get better outcomes, I don't see the problem with doing that. People believe that they can be their same old selves without any concern about what the impact that might have on other people. Really kind of drive me insane, but that's another issue altogether. But I think that this fear that exists in our world is borne out in people who are afraid to confront power holders, and power holders are afraid of making mistakes in their conversations and interactions with people who are not like them. And that's why I think that, most of the people, it's just been the way it's worked out so far, that we work with at the executive director level or the CEO level in our organizations that we are engaged with are white. And yet when they're presented with a process and a platform for driving decision making down in their organizations that they can understand and they think is reasonable, they're willing to do it because they find that it's beneficial. So we just need to be able to create common ground so that, or at least understandable ground, where people can engage without fear. If they can do that, we'd all be a lot better off. But that's, of course, much easier said than done.
Right.
And,
Right.
It's something that we stumble with, and it creates, chaos in our lives.
I mean, in my experience, the thing, and I think you said this already, the thing we have to start with is at least just having the conversation. Like, start with talking about it. And I think that's, in the United States, we're not really good at having uncomfortable conversations.
We are not.
It's something we avoid tremendously. And I think it's been a detriment in the workplace. It's been a detriment to communities, to not even just, relegated just to the professional world. But it's hard, like you said, I think I've had that conversation about political correctness. I think forcing people to speak politically correct is a means to not allow for clarity in decision making and power.
Right.
Because then you're skirting around issues. You're not being very direct. You're spending more time thinking about. The language not to use than just being true to your heart and speaking.
Absolutely.
And I think that, it's a fine line of it goes both for the listener and the speaker. When you push someone to just be honest and just have these difficult conversations, the listener has to be aware. You might hear something that's offensive. You might hear something that offends you and that hurts your feelings or whatever. But you can't get past that until you hear it and have the conversation. I always tell people, I much prefer the person who's in my face and just says, I don't like you. Let's be clear. Because then I'm clearer about what's happening and I can have a better idea of why things are falling the way that they're falling, as opposed to someone not saying anything, and then I'm left to make up stories in my head, right? And then I start thinking I'm crazy.
Right.
And it's not really happening.